Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Welcome to the new and improved St. John's Lutheran Church. Before we jump into this, I'm going to use the opportunity to say to people, last night at the parish council meeting, we spent probably an hour on recommendations from a COVID task force that formed a couple of weeks ago. And the long and the short of it is, if you're at St. John's, you're in a mask. And no exceptions, period. There'll be other changes that you notice, like for example, the elevator is now for Meals on Wheels only. So everybody else is coming through the ramp door. If we have an event that's downstairs, obviously we'll have to allow for the use of the elevator, but we're going to try to make sure there aren't any events downstairs. There'll be, communion will be pretty much the way it's been, only we're going to move the wine farther away from the center aisle, and a couple of other changes. There won't be any solos anymore. There'll be no singing of any kind. And the thing that's going to impact most people is, if you're on this property, you're in a mask. So, more to follow, but just thought we'd get that out. Well, welcome. We are in chapter 9 of Celebration of Discipline, and this is about the discipline of service, and with an emphasis on humility. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this book that Dick Foster wrote so many years ago now. It's challenging. It's something that, it's one of those things like, I know this is good for me, and yet I look at some of the things that he just says, and when I think about the implications of it, I need to focus my life in ways that I've allowed to slip, and I just pray for the gift of your Holy Spirit to show me those things and to give me the wisdom and the courage to move forward in a good way. So we commend ourselves to your care, and once again, thank you for this book. In Jesus' name, amen. So I had a thought on the way in today about, since we're here, John, there's in the top left-hand corner, there's copies of the book.
Oh, okay.
I had some ideas about what to do next, and just throwing one out, you and I had talked about the connection between the New Testament and the Old Testament, and I was thinking we could do it's like a college textbook, and it's called The History of Ancient Israel by Bill Bright, and it's just like a historical review in one volume of the story of the Jews, basically, in the biblical period. And I thought, that wouldn't be bad. So that's one idea I've had.
You've read that and liked
Yeah, it's a really good book. One of the jokes in the trade is William Bright was PhD, great historian and archaeologist and so forth. And the guy that was his mentor when he was doing his doctorate was William Albright. And he's even better. So the little thing in the academic world is Bright's bright, but he's not Albright. So that was one idea that would be a little bit different than normal, but would help to understand the story that is the Old Testament, give a skeleton to hang things on. And as I'm saying that, I'm kind of looking around the room. There's a novel by Lutheran pastor Walter Wangerin, and it's called The Book of God. And it's a relatively thick novel and God's the lead character, and it tells the story of the Bible. So that would get at the same thing, but as a novel, it's, I think, less intimidating.
Enough factual, you think it would be good?
Yeah, the basic storyline is right. He takes some of the dialogue from the scriptures and then fills it out to meet his needs in telling the story. So Wangren's a Lutheran pastor, and he was for the longest time at Valparaiso University, and was instrumental in a storytelling group that, like when I was in grad school, they had their annual conference at Wheaton where I was going to school, and he came and he was the keynote speaker. So Teresa and I went, and he and his wife had adopted an African American girl, and he spent an hour telling a story that was centered around her coming to terms with her identity of being black in a white family, and who am I, and you know, all the normal things that a young girl goes through as she's aging into, you know, adulthood. And he had people laughing so hard their sides were splitting and crying, and fantastic storyteller. He wrote the Book of the Dun Cow, which was very popular. But that novel would do the same thing.
Sounds like that might keep our interest more. I mean, the textbook approach sounds dry.
I kind of agree with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it would appeal more.
What do you think, Ted? About the next book?
Oh, doesn't matter to me.
He's along for the ride.
He wants. Okay. Well, we'll order a couple of copies of the Book of God, and then let people look at it before we say we definitely have to do this. One thing that I have not seen here is there's usually this Abingdon maps of the Bible on a tripod. Do we have that?
No.
That might be worth spending some money on. You know, because you've got this story that runs back and forth from the, you know, Persian Gulf over to the Gulf of Aqaba and into Egypt, and you know, it's like, where are they? What are we talking
Yeah,
about?
it's nice to see that. Mm-hmm.
So, changing gears a little bit, what do you think of the discipline of service?
I liked it. I think everybody in the whole wide world needs to read that chapter.
Okay. What would they get for their effort? So to speak.
Well, in the different ways that you can be a servant.
Okay. So variety of service.
Yeah, the variety of service and the difference between choosing to serve and being a servant.
Okay.
I think that needs to be in there.
Instead of something that I do every once in a blue moon, who I am.
Yeah.
Closer to identity. Okay.
Mhm.
What else?
I thought you had an opportunity to make an analogy to the discipline of study, I think we did, where we talked about, I think it was repetition, and then it was understanding and comprehension. But then it got to understanding and concentrating, Then it got to comprehension. And to me, if you're just doing it for the mechanics of the discipline, trying to be a servant, it's all mechanics. Maybe it's not really, I got the feeling he was talking about that as not being so good. You're doing that for yourself, you're not doing that as a true servant. And I guess from my standpoint, just by doing it, gets you maybe a stepping stone to learning, get the aha moment that, hey, this is what it's about.
Yeah, I was thinking that there needs to be an internal appropriation of the idea as opposed to, oh geez, it's Monday, I have to,
Exactly, yeah.
go, check the blocks or and I had a colleague who I was good friends with for years, and when we were all done being in the military, I ran into him and we went to dinner back when we could do that sort of thing. And he told me that every morning he would go to the physical training formation, and then he'd go home, get cleaned up, and eat breakfast. And while he was eating breakfast, he would get the training schedule for not only his unit, but the whole post. And then he would find the place where he needed to be in order to be seen by the higher ranking people. And he would come up with some kind of reason to be there. And he did a lot better in the Army than I did, so maybe it worked, but I felt like, why don't you just put that effort into doing your job, And truth of the matter is, it's, he wouldn't have done it if it didn't work. And there are a lot of people that they're all show and no go. And I don't think my friend was, but he certainly had a ear to the ground for politics, and checking the block and making sure he was seen.
Yeah.
But well, anyway, he starts out with this quote from Bernard of Clairvaux, who Bernard was born into the knight class in France. One of his uncles was the founder of the Templars, which is kind of an interesting thing. And when the Templars were a bunch of knights that went on the First Crusade, so about 1099, and there were 7 of them, and they decided that they were going to stay in the Holy Land, and they organized themselves as a religious fraternity, and the new, we call themselves the protector of the Holy Sepulchre instead of king, gave them a barracks in the Al-Aqsa Mosque that's still on the Temple Mount. And then that kind of led into them providing route security for pilgrims. And while they were doing that, they decided that they were going to become a monastic order. And the uncle went back to France on a fundraising trip and went to Clairvaux, where his nephew was a Cistercian abbot, and said, we need a rule. So Bernard of Clairvaux wrote the monastic rule for the Knights Templar. And he is also the author of the hymn, O Sacred Head Now Wounded. And he's one of the people that, like Luther and Melanchthon, and then over in Switzerland, Calvin, they liked Bernard. They felt like he was one of the church fathers that got the gospel, and so they quoted him often. And so here he shows up, learn the lesson that if you are to do the work of a prophet, what you need is not a scepter, but a hoe. So scepter is what kings hold, a hoe is what peasants use to work. And that's his quote for the opening of this. There's a church in Dallas, I think, that commissioned a sculpture. Figurines are life-size, and it's Peter sitting in a chair. He's got 1 foot forward, and he's looking appalled. And kneeling in front of him is a figure with a towel over his head, another one tied around his waist, and he's washing Peter's feet. So that is John 13:14 that he quotes in here. And it's a pretty powerful image. And what we're talking about here as a disciple of Jesus is to follow him, go where he goes, do what he does. And he says, if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do as I have done to you. So, given who this is coming from, what do we do with it?
Just my opinion. That's a long, long time ago, and I think it just stands for a representation of what you do for me, I would do for you. And the thing about the foot has never caught on with me, and probably never will. But I get it, but I think it was a different time and a different place, and there are so many other things that you could do for people. I get the symbolism of it, but after that, it just does not hit home with me. I'm sorry,
So,
but
toe jam doesn't float your boat?
not a bit.
Okay.
Not a bit. I would gladly do mostly anything within reason to help someone and everything else. But that is today. I understand what he's saying. I really truly do. But I don't see a lot of people walking around with 30 feet. So, and I'm one of these guys. Seriously, there are times in life. This is where I take it the opposite direction. Wash your own feet instead of depending on somebody all the time.
So what are you doing on Maundy Thursday? There's some churches,
Oh yeah,
particularly among the brethren,
That's right.
that, well, to point a couple of things out, in the Gospel of John, there is a Last Supper, but there's no institution of Holy Communion. There's a foot washing. So if you read John and you're looking for where are the words of institution, they're not there. And in fact, there's a book on it by a very prestigious scholar named Joachim Jeremias, and he makes the case that because of the Gospel of John, you cannot say with confidence that Jesus celebrated the Passover. And in John's Gospel, you don't have the words of institution. What you have is the foot washing. Since Jeremias wrote, a lot of people have reacted pretty violently to his book, and the current thinking is that the synoptic gospels of Mark and Matthew and Luke all follow one basic outline, and that John is somewhat later and is a very carefully organized theological reflection and not really a chronological telling of the story of Jesus. So, for example, 4/5 of John are all in Holy Week. He has Jesus cleansing the temple at the very beginning of his ministry. And it's just the sequencing in John is not the same as the other Gospels. And I heard Fred Craddock, who's now retired from Emory Theological Seminary, say that there's no Last Supper in John because the whole thing is a commentary on the Last Supper. So it's in John that you get the whole bread of life discourse, which is about the communion. And John's gospel is organized, there's a book of signs, and he has 7, good biblical number. And then there's the kind of basic narrative about the cross and death and the burial. But he thinks that the whole gospel is oriented in on theologically explaining who Jesus is more than a biography. So his foot washing is not in the synoptic gospel, but it's extremely prominent in John. And the reality of the quote is, all right, who is Jesus to you? You know, you got to think that through. And you know, we use the word Lord all the time. In our society, somebody that would have been an equivalent of a Lord would be like extreme autocrat, dictator. Joked around one time about when you get to heaven, you'll know who Jesus is because he looks like, man, maybe 5'10", olive skin, dark brown hair, walking around with a coffee mug that says, "Me boss, you not." You know, he's that tangible and real of a human being, but he is absolutely, totally in charge. And there are hints of things, for example, when he has demon-possessed people brought in front of him, like the one up in the northeast side of the Sea of Galilee. This guy's living in the caves, and they've chained him up and all that sort of stuff, and they land there, and this guy comes running out of the tombs, screaming like a banshee, and throws himself on the ground, and the demons are speaking through him and saying, "What do you have to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? We know who you are, blah, 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 blah. Don't destroy us. Let us go into that herd of pigs over there." And so he goes, okay. And so they go into their herd of pigs, who run down the hill and drown. And one guy figured out at today's prices, those pigs were probably about $1,200 a head. And the people were really upset. And it's like, yeah, no kidding, you know, you just lost all your livestock. But the interesting question that doesn't get dealt with, but it's sitting there, is why are they afraid of him? You know, it's like, who is this guy that the demons are terrified of him? And the answer is, they know that he is the Christ, and we don't. We spend so much time trying to explain Jesus to people and all of their stupid ideas that, you know, God knows where they get some of them from, certainly not the scriptures. And yet the reality of Jesus is, he is literally, you know, taking John, the Logos, the consciousness of God in flesh. That's huge. That's off the charts huge. There's nothing anywhere in the history of the cosmos that comes even into the same stadium with that. And then, you know, Paul's thing in Philippians, the 2nd chapter, there's a hymn that he either wrote or quotes that they call it the Descent hymn, and it, you know, it takes Christ at the beginning and it takes him all the way down to the cross and to death and to the grave and to hell, and then he rises and extends that resurrection life to us. That is so off the charts big that it really truly defies ability to put it into words that make sense. And we are so used to it that we don't pay attention. And here you have the Logos of God washing feet. And Paul says he did not cling to his equality with God as if it were something that needed to be grasped, but he emptied himself and took on the form of a human being, and then the form of a slave, and went to the cross, you know, for the sins of the whole world, yes, but let's get personal, for Rick's sins, John's sins, Clarence's sins, every one of us. And Nicky Gumbel said in the Alpha Course, if you were the only human being that ever sinned, Jesus still would have come and done what he did to save you. So it's that personal. It's that big. And then he says, follow me. And he says that my disciples will be where I am. So this chapter about the discipline of service takes everything that we've done so far in this book and the whole concept of I'm a disciple of Jesus of Nazareth and says, oh yeah, live it. So I think it's huge. I find it terribly challenging.
Yeah, and with the whole washing of the feet, hearing what you said isn't, and the older I get, the more this strikes home, but isn't this also letting your feet be washed? Being that person to say, okay, isn't that serving as well?
Yeah, he says in here,
I mean,
there's a
because, you know,
service in allowing somebody to serve you.
yeah,
And,
yeah.
you know, that foot washing thing, you know, like if you, you know, two least popular liturgical events in Lutheranism, feet washing and ashes. People are much more inclined to say, all right, you can put ashes on my head and say, dust you are and to dust you shall return. But that foot washing thing, they don't like it. And it's hard to do, and it's probably harder to sit there and let somebody do it to you. So you're right on that.
Historically, was that a normal activity? The way it was written up, it sounded like, you know, like Ted's saying, from back then, you know, it's like an example of what to do, not what we would do today. But it sounded like it was a common thing back then, for the way this is written up.
It was the job of a slave.
Okay.
And
So they're all barefoot and they got their feet washed when they.
and even if they had
Sandals.
sandals, they're still walking around in dusty
Dusty roads.
roads in a desert. And if you look at the foot washing in the context, the disciples have been having this argument of who's the greatest. And you know, human beings are always oriented on the pecking order. Who's more prestigious? Who's got more clout? And every society has some form of clout. So, for example, in India, it's a Hindu country, and they have this whole worldview of the body politic of people is like that of a man, and there is the head that does all the observing and thinking and decision making. Then there's the upper body and the arms, it's the warrior class, and then the torsos, the people that make the money, and it goes all the way down to the bottom of your feet. Those are the low caste and out of caste people. And they use the image of a human body to do that. So in Hinduism, with the sense of death and re-death, the reincarnation and karma and all that sort of stuff, the sense is that whatever you did in previous lives determines who you are now. And so this group that is at the very top of the heap are male Brahmin, and they are considered to be the elite because they have the greatest amount of ability to affect their karma. And the whole end state of Hinduism is to get out of the cycle of samsara, is what it's called. And their structure, their society is built around that. One time I was in India and we were at a newspaper in Chennai, and one of the editors that was showing us around was Brahmin. And the man took his cup of tea and he was talking with us and explaining their publication system, and he just sort of nonchalantly reached over and put the cup on his desk, but put it on a pencil, and it tipped over. And he didn't even notice. Tea running all over the table. He was Brahmin. He didn't clean that stuff up. You know, there was some low caste person that was a cleaner that would come in and do it. And the American society is based on cash. You know, it's like jobs are prestigious because they draw money. And you see it, for example, with celebrities and sports stars and so forth. They have fame, which turns into cash, and therefore they have status. There are jobs in every company, you know which group of people, even if you don't know their salary, you know which group of people get the most amount of money. My culture, the Army, they wear it on the collars of their shirt, you know, and it's like, you know right away, you know, who the most important people are, and everybody's got that. And you know, we just worry about it. And what Jesus is talking about here is an entire social structure that is opposite of the world. He says, you know, the lords of the Gentiles, they make sure you know who they are, and they boss people around, and they demonstrate their power, and you know, all that kind of stuff. And he says it's not to be that way with you. He who would be the first among you must become the least. People don't like that. They don't mind putting on a little show of egalitarianism, but you know, like, we're just coming out of an election cycle, thanks be to God. We talk about, you know, part of the Christian remembrance in our society is public servants. You know, just pick any politician, and the higher up they are in the power structure down in DC or Harrisburg, they may do something, they may talk about public service and so forth and so on, but I don't know, pick the Speaker of the House as an example. She's a public servant, but I guarantee you she doesn't give up that free Air Force plane to fly back and forth to California on anytime she wants to go and take her whole family. And I talked to Warren Hatch one time in a grad school class, and he said something that stuck with me. He said, no one has ever gone to Washington and gone home a better person. You know, it's like the amount of money is beyond comprehension. Sociologist taught for years at Eastern University, was a great youth leader named Tony Campolo. One point in time, he decided that he was going to run for Congress, and he didn't care if he won or not. He wanted to have the campaign so that he could raise issues about the district. And he said within a week, he got a phone call saying, would you meet with so-and-so? It was, you know, Campola talking to another Italian, and it was a mob boss. And the guy came over and he said, you know, we live here. You know, you were talking about drugs and crime and all this other kind of stuff. We don't want that in our neighborhood. It's how they made their money, but they didn't want it close to their house. And they offered to pay not only for the whole campaign, but to make sure that Campola was never short of cash ever again. And this is just for a congressman in the Philadelphia area, Wayne. And you know, he politely declined and he lost the election and he went back to teaching. But you know, the appearance of things is a problem. One of the things Foster raises, you know, to get more into the book here, there's a section he calls self-righteous service versus true service. I think that's what you were referring to at the beginning. Looking good versus being good. I can't tell you the page, John, because I've got it on Kindle.
128.
128.
128.
Yeah.
So he walks through a list of things here. He goes, self-righteous service comes through human effort. It expends immense amount of energy calculating and scheming how to render service. Their sociological charts and surveys are devised so that we can help people. Is that bad?
No.
There's some good in it, but the underlying motive is not. That's where that can cause problems, I'm thinking.
Okay. So, you know, it's like the technique may not be bad to have good information, but why?
Well, I would hope that it would be like, maybe you said, or Clarence, somebody said, like that first stepping stone kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, even though maybe you do want everybody to look at you because you're doing this or doing that, after a while, you see what good you're doing. And then maybe that self-righteousness will ease back a little bit.
Yeah.
The hopes that would happen. So I don't see all bad in it.
Well, if you're looking to truly help people, that thought should be first, and you're working to how to do that.
Yeah.
So you never lose that thought if you're following that principle.
Yeah. I'm suddenly reminded of a film they showed us the first day of seminary called I Heard the Owl Call My Name. And it's maybe it's on YouTube now. The story was there was a young man that was graduating from the seminary, and in the Episcopal system you do 6 months or a year as a deacon, and like an internship, and then you get ordained a priest. And right before graduation, the parents of this young man came to the dean of the seminary and told him that they had just gotten word from their family doctor that their son had some incurable disease, and he had about a year and a half to live. And they thought that the church ought to know that before they assigned him, and the young man didn't know. That was the storyline. HIPAA.
Yeah.
The dean got with the guy's bishop, and they sent him on his diaconate internship to an Indian reservation up in Alaska. And he went up there with these ideas about, I'm going to use my white privilege, to borrow a modern term, and I'm going to help these people. And over the course of the year, he got to the dawning realization that they kind of didn't need or want his help, and that what happened to him was he became invested in the people and in the community and so forth. And then, of course, the story ends with him sitting down with the guy that he thought was his enemy when he got there, the medicine man, you know, like the representation of the shamanism and so forth. They become buddies by the end of the story. And he said, you know, I was walking this morning and I heard the owl call my name.
Oh. Yeah.
And it meant, you're next. It's time to get your affairs in order. So I think that story kind of connects with this in terms of, all right, there's nothing wrong with helping people, but you could get your motivation screwed up.
Well, sometimes, I think, even that example at the beginning, we want to help people, but we start off with our own value system,
Okay.
not realizing that, you know, we have to maybe make changes and understand their value system, so we truly don't make that connection. And it may take a while to make that connection.
And, you know, like listening to the people. Jesus did that. Interesting to me, like they brought this guy to him that's like paralyzed, and they work their way through the crowd and plop him down in front of Jesus. And he said, "What would you like me to do for you?" You know, to me, it would have been like, "Oh, this guy needs to walk." And he asked him, and I thought that was good. So he says the opposite of this self-righteous service here, true service comes from a relationship with the divine other deep inside of a person. We serve out of a whispered prompting, a divine urging. Energy is expended, but it's not the frantic energy of the flesh. A spiritual director named Thomas Kelly writes, "I find he never guides me into an intolerable scramble of panting feverishness," which is, well, like you look in the media right now. How do you get your cause out there? You know, it's got to be this crisis that's going to end the world, and then you'll get media attention and money and, you know, pass laws and, you know, that kind of scheming to push your agenda forward. You know, if it was really the end of the world, probably somebody other than just you knows about it. You know, maybe they're working on it. Self-righteous service is impressed with the big deal. True service finds it almost impossible to distinguish the small from the large. You know, if you're really looking at an individual and asking the question, "Can I help?" It, you know, kind of doesn't matter if it's insignificant or massive. It's this flowing out of you that matters. When I read this, I thought of, you know, the rock star Bono in the group U2. He was asked to get involved in it was like a drought and famine situation in the Horn of Africa. And he said in this interview I saw that he went the first year and you could hardly get around because there was the UN and the International Red Cross and all these celebrities and so forth. And when he went back the next year, the only thing that was left was a bunch of nuns. And he said the problem hadn't abated at all, but it was no longer the hot, big issue. And these sisters were bringing in medicine and food, and I think Doctors Without Borders was there as well. So, you know, they were the serious, real organizations as opposed to people that just wanted the photo op. And I sort of thought of that here. Self-righteous service requires external reward. What's my return on investment for doing this? True service rests contented in hiddenness. It does not fear the light and the blare of attention, but it does not seek them.
My kind of people.
Yeah. Kind of like, I'm here.
And you never know it.
Yeah.
Or when you do find out, you really respect it, because they're not looking for it.
Right.
Yeah, and we have people like that here with, you know, Meals on Wheels. You know, they really care about getting food to shut-ins. And they're not looking to be on the news, or and they're awkward in front of the camera. You know, it's the last thing that they wanted. You know, they just, you know, can you leave so my beans are almost done, you know. Self-righteous service is highly concerned about results. It eagerly waits to see if the person served will reciprocate in kind. It becomes bitter when the results fall below expectation. says self-righteous service picks and chooses whom to serve. Gotta get that photo op in. It's like, I help you, but camera's over here. Good luck to you. True service is indiscriminate in its ministry. It has heard the command of Jesus to be servant of all. And many spiritual leaders in the history of the church, he quotes Assisi saying, being the servant of all, I am bound to serve all and to administer the balm-bearing words of my Lord. And there's that verse in the Psalms about there is a balm in Gilead, I think is what he's referencing. In our own Lutheran tradition, it was 500 years ago in November that Luther penned a treatise in which he said that the Christian was, because of their status in Jesus Christ, the free Lord of all, that they had been given by Jesus this status, and at the same time they were the servant of all. So they were set free from sin and bondage by Jesus and adopted into the royal family and a seat at the head table and all that resurrection stuff in order for them to be involved in the family business, and they're free to be the servant of everyone. And Luther was good at those paradoxes. Lord of all, servant of all, at the same time. And of course, our spiritual condition, his big one was simulus et peccator. In the same instant, I'm justified and I'm still a sinner. And I live in that paradox. And it's because of Jesus that I'm free to serve. And self-righteous service is affected by moods and whims. It can serve only when there's a feeling to serve. Ill health or inadequate sleep controls the desire to serve. Oh, God knows that's true. It's like, you don't get a good night's sleep, you don't feel like doing much at 8 o'clock in the morning. True service ministers simply and faithfully because there's a need. I think one of the great servants of our time that became something of a celebrity was Mother Teresa. And her story is a really interesting one. She was a teacher in a very prestigious girls' school in Calcutta and a mystic. She had beatific visions all the time, and that's what led her to take on the work that the Sisters of Mercy ended up becoming so famous for. And when she got all the permissions and so forth and literally walked away from this very comfortable life into the streets of Calcutta, all of that stopped. She didn't have the beatific visions anymore. There was no mountaintop spiritual experiences and so forth. There was just this grinding piece in front of her, except for one 6-month period of time, like 20-some years into it. And it was almost like, all right, I'll give you a reprieve, and then it's right back at it. And she came to understand that she had asked for and was given this gift of really feeling the despair and having to kind of work through that. And if you're talking about feeling like serving, well, who does? I mean, it's like, I think it's great when people do things like, I'm taking the kids down to the homeless shelter, we're going to serve a Thanksgiving meal. Okay, that's like a commercial. Who's going to be there on Monday? The hunger doesn't go away, but all the high vis does. And the church is at its best when it takes these things on and does it in season and out. True service is a lifestyle. True service can withhold the service as freely as perform it. You don't have to do it. If, for example, the need is solved, you don't have to keep your organization going around it. The Lord will move you on to something else. True service builds the community. It draws people in, it binds, it heals, it builds. Running out of time here, I'm running my mouth too much. Next section on service and humility. He starts out saying, more than any other single way, the grace of humility is worked into our lives through the discipline of service. And I think this is where that inward appropriation starts to happen. Where I'm not the hero riding in out of the sunset at the last minute and saving all these people. I'm with them. You know, it's like I can't remember his name, but at Christ Lutheran in Lancaster, I can see him. He was completely gray. He had a special needs child that was with him all the time. He was in this dead church with no hope of ever coming around again, and he had a food distribution program and a meal. And that guy was so integrated into the community, it was unbelievable. He told me that he couldn't retire because he'd never made enough money to qualify for a pension. You know, it's like, how we let that happen, I don't know. But, I mean, that guy, this decrepit little church in a decrepit part of town, with a bunch of transient people, and that was his world. And he loved it. Anyway, nothing disciplines the inordinate desire of the flesh like service, and nothing transforms the desires of the flesh like service in hiddenness. He references a book that I would commend to you. It's from the 1700s, so a couple hundred years old at this point. The author is William Law, and it's a classic. It's called A Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life. And it's, thanks to Foster's organization, Renovare, it's still in print. In it, Law urges that every day should be viewed as a day of humility. And how does he suggest that we do this? By learning to serve others. Law understands that it is the discipline of service that brings humility into life. If we want humility, he counsels to us, condescend to all the weakness and infirmities of your fellow creatures, cover their frailties, love their excellencies, encourage their virtues, relieve their wants, rejoice in their prosperities, be compassionate to their distress, receive their friendship, overlook their unkindness, forgive their malice, be servant of servants, and condescend to do the lowest offices to the lowest of mankind. So that's William Law.
That's a long list.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think in the 18th century they liked lists. So, if you read some of the prayers, they just go on and on and Um, As the chapter unrolls, he has the section called Yes, But, like, okay, Jesus said it, so I'm not gonna contradict him, but I don't wanna play. If I do such and such a thing, they'll take advantage of me. And yes, they will. We had a couple of young women that hung out here about a month ago, and it was pouring down rain. They had nowhere to go, and Teresa let them in, and we were chit-chatting with them a little bit, and got them a cup of coffee and so forth. And in about 5 minutes, the one of them was like, "Do you think you could buy me more minutes for my phone?" And, just. She was kind of a pro at being helpless. And, if you're sitting there going, "Oh, I don't want to be taken advantage of," you will. If you, nothing that you do is beyond the reach of being abused. It just, if you're going to work with people, that's what they're like. And, it's got to be okay. There's some things you can do to cut the angle. Like, I used to teach for the University of Phoenix down in Philadelphia, and where I got up, I'd take the train down, take the subway over. When I came off the subway, there was this guy, "Hey man, can you spare a dime for, hungry, blah, blah, blah." And I talked with him and so forth, and I always offered to take him to this diner. I said, "Well, come with me. I'm going over to the diner. I'm going to get a cup of coffee, and I'll buy you breakfast." He never wanted breakfast. And it's like, wow, how hungry are you that you don't want to go into this nice diner and get a meal? And a couple of years into this, there was an article in the Enquirer about this guy, and he was making a couple $100,000 a year with this hustle and not paying any taxes on it.
Should take you to breakfast.
He didn't need breakfast. It's like his personal trainer would have, gotten on him for not eating properly or whatever. But are there scam artists? Absolutely. And does that change the command of our Lord to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the sick? It's like, try not to be stupid. If you get burned once, try not to fall for it a second time. But that doesn't ever take away the fact that there are people out there who really do need, and I would say deserve, our help. When we choose to be a servant, we give up the right to be in charge. So now you're telling me I'm going to get taken advantage of and I'm not going to be the boss. Why do I want to do this?
Yeah.
Then this section, service in the marketplace, we're like 2 minutes. This is where he runs through the business about the checklist that we discussed. And he ends up stressing hiddenness and smallness and anonymity and so forth. He lists some services that you might not think of, like the service of being served. It's like, let somebody do something for you. That takes off the I'm superior piece. It's like, let them be kind. Let them, he pushes, there's a service in just being courteous to people. Like somebody makes a mistake driving and they kind of cut you off. You can sit there and ride the horn and be on their back end and, like, you got in my way. And it's like, well, let them. You never screwed up driving.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
The specific acts will vary from culture to culture, but the purpose is always the same, to acknowledge the other and to affirm their worth. You know, that's a service. There's a service in being hospitable. Take somebody home for lunch. There's a service in listening. Scriptures talk about bearing one another's burdens, and that's not just something you do for 5 minutes in an hour-long worship service. That's, you know, you take it on. And my one sister-in-law is a very serious Christian, and one of her neighbors couldn't walk her dog anymore. And so Mary, every time she walks her dog, she swings by and gets her neighbor's dog. And that allows this woman to have the companionship of a pet. You know, it's like nobody sees it. They know about it now because I ran my big mouth, but you know, that's a bearing of a burden that allows this, you know, it's like it's hard to calculate how much a dog is worth to a person. And conversely, Lincoln said one time, "You think you're a big deal? Try to tell somebody else's dog what to do." What's about that? And finally, there is a service in sharing the word of life with another. So, very challenging one, and the last of the outward disciplines. You know, the book's structure about the inner disciplines, then the outer ones. So we come to the end of the second part of the book, and next week we start with the corporate discipline of confession, which should be interesting. So, if you're of a mind, we have a worship service in the next room. I saw at least one.